بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على خير معلم سيدنا ونبينا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة وأكمل التسليم. اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا وزدنا علما نافعا آمين يا رب العالمين. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to raise a hot welcome to my dear and loving students. Today's lesson, inshallah, will be about passive versus active voices. So let's start with the active voice. For instance, we have the following example. Of course, in the active voice, my grandfather planted this tree. Whereas in the passive form, we may say, this tree was planted by my grandfather. Now, my students, the following chart shows you the passive verb tenses with both active voice and passive voice. Let's start with the present simple. In the active voice, we say, he delivers the letters. Whereas in the passive voice, we may say, the letters are delivered. Now we move to the past simple. In the active voice, the sentence is, he delivered the letters. Whereas in the passive voice, we say, the letters were delivered. Now we move to the future simple. In the active voice, he will deliver the letters. Whereas in the passive voice, we may say, the letters will be delivered. Now we move to the present continuous. The active voice is, he is delivering the letters. Whereas in the passive voice, we may say, the letters are being delivered. Now we move to the past continuous. In the active voice, the sentence is, he was delivering the letters. Whereas in the passive voice, the letters were being delivered. Now with going to. In the active voice, we can say, he is going to deliver the letters. Whereas in the passive voice, we can say, the letters are going to be delivered. Now we move to the present perfect. In the present perfect, my students, we may say in the active voice, he has delivered the letters. Whereas in the passive voice, the letters have been delivered. Now we move to the past perfect. In the active voice, he had delivered the letters. Whereas in the passive voice, we may say, the letters had been delivered. Now we move to the infinitive. The infinitive, my students, in the active voice, we have the following example. He has to deliver the letters. Whereas in the passive voice, we may say, the letters have to be delivered. Now with modals. In the active voice, we have the example with must. He must deliver the letters. In the passive voice, we may say, the letters must be delivered. Now, my students, we move to when to use it. 1. When the agent, that is to say, the person who does the action, is unknown or unimportant or obvious from the context, as the following examples show you. Jane was shot. Here, my students, we don't know who shot her. Another example. This church was built in 1815. Here, my students, or in the following example, it is an important agent. Now we move to the third example. He has been arrested. So here, it's obviously by the police. It's something clear enough. Now number 2, to make more polite or formal statements. As the following example, the car hasn't been cleaned. Here, it is a more polite action to say the car hasn't been cleaned. But when we say, for instance, you haven't cleaned the car, here it is less polite action when we say you haven't cleaned the car. Number 3, to put emphasis on the agent. As an example, the new library will be opened by the Queen. Now, when the action is more important than the agent, as in processes, instructions, events, reports, headlines, new items and advertisements, as an example, 30 people were killed in the earthquake. Now we move to double object verbs. So my students, when we have verbs that take two objects, like for example, give somebody something, we can convert the active sentence into a passive one in two ways. The first way, my students, by making the indirect inanimate object the subject of the passive voice sentence, which is also the way that we usually prefer. As an example, I was given this book by Rick. Now, using the second way, by making the direct inanimate object the subject of the passive voice, as the following example shows you, and is clear enough, this book was given to me by Rick. Whereas the sentence or the basic sentence is Rick gave me this book. Me here is the indirect object, whereas this book is the direct object. Now my students, remember that some of the verbs that take two objects are give, for instance, tell, send, show, bring, write, offer, pay, etc. When the indirect object is alone, after the verb in the passive voice sentence, it needs the preposition to. Now, my students, if the indirect object of the active voice sentence is a personal pronoun, it has to be changed into a subject pronoun to be the subject of the passive voice sentence, as the following chart shows you, my students, how it can be changed from the subject to the object. For instance, we have the subject I. It changes to me. For instance, you, we keep it as it is, to you. Now we have the subject he. It changes to the object him. Now we have the subject she. It changes to the object her. Now it changes to it, and we keep it as it is. Now we move to the subject we. We changes to as. Then you, it changes to you. We keep it as it is. Then lastly, we have the subject they. It changes to the object them. Now, my students, we move to practices. So let's practice one. And as you know, practice makes perfect. So practice one, they ask you, my students, to complete the sentences with the correct passive form of the verbs in brackets. Then they ask you to use the present simple. So let's start with sentence A. English, and we have the verb between brackets speak in many countries. B, or sentence B, the post. We have the verb deliver at about 7 o'clock every morning. C, the building use anymore. And we have here the building use between brackets, the verb to use. Sentence D, how often the Olympic Games hold. And we have here the verb between brackets hold. Sentence E, how your name spell. Sentence F, my salary pay between brackets every month. G, or sentence G, these cars not made in Japan. And we have here the verb between brackets not make. Sentence H, the name of the people who committed the crime not know. We have here the verb between brackets not know. It is in the negative form. Sentence I, and the last sentence in practice number 1 is his travel expenses not pay between brackets. The verb here is in the negative form, by his company. Now, my students, we move to practice 2, or let's practice 2, in which they ask you, my students, to complete the sentences with the correct passive form of the verbs in brackets. Use the past simple. So, in the first practice, they ask you to use the present simple, whereas now, in practice number 2, they ask you to use the past simple. Sentence A, my car between brackets repair last week. B, this song not right. We have the verb between brackets in the negative form, which is not right, by John Lennon. C, the phone answer by a young girl. D, or sentence D, the fill, we have the verb between brackets make 10 years ago. E, or sentence E, when tennis invent. Sentence F, the car, between brackets the verb is in the negative form, not damaged in the accident. Sentence G, the original building pull, between brackets the verb is the affirmative form pull, down in 1965. H or sentence H, where this pot make. I, and the last sentence, when this bridge build. Well, just for today lesson, my students, thank you so much for your kind and considerable attention. See you inshallah in another lecture. Goodbye.